I made these simple ruins in a previous video. At the end of that video, I left them concrete textured, fairly simple, but solidly built. A decent set of ruins that's cheap to make, that's going to be a good base to work forward and embellish from there. Today, I'm going to show you some of those embellishments, some of the things that I've done to those ruins since, and in particular, I want to show you the major improvement on the basing of the ruins. Let's get to work. So the first thing that I want to do is add some visual depth on the exterior walls, and I'm going to do that first by cutting a bunch of strips of foam core that are all the same width and at least 8 or 9 inches long. You want it to be as long as the tallest part of any of your ruins, really. Make a ton of these strips. Since there's not a lot of surface area here, if you are using cheaper foam core, I would advise just pulling the paper off of it right to start with so that you don't have to worry about it peeling later on. And what I did with all of these strips, I added them to the outside of my ruins in between each of the sets of windows. So between windows or between windows and doors, as well as on the corners. I added these pieces perpendicular to the walls so that they stick out nicely. Now, after we've got all of those attached, we're going to go and revisit a step that we did in the previous video where we're going to mix up some black paint with some white school glue or with some Mod Podge, whatever it is you've got on hand. I painted all of these buttresses black so that they were covered on all sides and the foam would not be exposed to the spray paint that we'll add onto them later, which would cause them to melt. In addition to that, the paint that we'll be adding later is going to let the color of the items underneath show through. So using this gray surface of the ruins and the black color of the buttresses, we're still going to have some visual differentiation here. So be careful that you don't slather the black paint too much on the walls. A little bit of overbrushing will be fine, but you don't want to leave big black splotches over the gray parts of the ruins because it'll show up pretty obviously later on. The next thing that I did after attaching these buttresses and painting them all black with that protective coating was I popped them all off of their original bases. I had originally attached these to 12-inch by 12-inch squares of foam core, and the 12-inch by 12-inch number came from 9th edition tournament style ruins to make sure that they matched the same footprint. And the reason why we used foam core previously is because for cheap, simple terrain, foam core is the cheap, simple material. However, I have since learned, thanks to Bill Making Stuff, who utilizes this quite often, of another cheap material that has much bigger benefits compared to using foam core for bases. See, the problem with foam core is that it will warp over time, especially if you're only painting one side and not the other. It'll tend to make it worse. But if you go to Walmart, go to the dollar store, go to a local home store, wherever it is where you can find cheap vinyl stick-on tile, I found this box of tile for $10 for 20 12-inch by 12-inch squares. Works out to about 50 cents a piece, and I utilized one of these tiles for each of these ruins. Very simple, super resilient. Not only are they resilient, but they're going to lay flat on the surface of the table. They're not going to warp over time. They're heavier so that they're going to make sure those ruins stay in place a little bit better, don't get knocked around as easily, especially if you've got kind of top heavy pieces that you put on these. That weight's going to help out. And in my case, I got kind of a stone textured tile, which made it a lot easier to make just a simple stone texture base out of it. The very first thing that I did to prepare these was I took them off of their wax paper backing, which is meant to come off easily so that you can move them onto the next surface that you're attaching them to, and I put them onto just like a plain newsprint paper. That paper is not going to peel off as easily over time. It's just going to provide your backing for your tile. Any other paper you have that isn't basically a wax paper is going to do the job here. You just want to put something on it that'll stick onto that vinyl tile and isn't going to come off over time. After that, because they have a glossy texture, I just took a synthetic steel wool and I sanded the whole top of the tile on each of them just to knock the gloss back to a semi-gloss finish so that I would have a good surface to paint from there. I spray primed them all in a flat black, I dry brushed them in a gray, and then I realized that the dry brushing wasn't coming out quite how I wanted it to, and I kind of did a more heavy overbrush. I pretty much painted them like 90% with the gray. And then I came back with a black wash and I washed them back down to a darker tone. Stupid simple stone texture ruins bases right there. If you're doing smaller pieces of terrain, you can cut them up with scissors or heftier shears if you've got them. But in my case, the 12 by 12 is exactly what I needed. So for 50 cents per tile, I got these 4 bases taken care of, and these ruins will go back onto those after we've finished the last step, the next to last step. And that next to last step is a retexturing spray. I didn't really like how that cement texture spray paint turned out in the last video. I am glad for the color that it came out, but at the end of the day, I really feel like any flat gray primer would have done the same job as this concrete texture. So if you're following the building of these ruins from start to finish, I would spray those ruins flat gray, and then I would paint those buttresses in a black, or go the opposite way, spray the ruins black, paint the buttresses gray, and I wouldn't spend the extra money for the supposedly textured paint. A regular flat spray primer will do just fine. But the next thing that I sprayed this time is a textured paint that I do really love. It's this stone texture spray paint, and I've used it for so many ruins in the past. Now, this stuff doesn't carry a ton of color in its spray. Most of what it's spraying is the texture. So like I was saying earlier, it's going to show through the colors that you have underneath, which in my case really helped out because I got the different tones of the gray and black from the ruins underneath. I left the flatter colors on the inside alone, and I just sprayed this stone texture on the outside of all of these ruins, and that is going to help give you a little bit more texture, a little bit more of that concrete feel, that brutalist texture to your ruins when everything is all said and done. And it's just a look that I like for the Warhammer 40k universe, and everything being made out of rockcrete, plastcrete, any of the random crete materials that they mention, hab blocks and buildings being built in. It gives you that kind of generic manufactured like stone texture thing throughout all of your ruins, and doing it so everything will really unify the look of the set of ruins. After I got that all sprayed down, I brought them back in, glued them down onto these ruins bases, and then this is what we ended up with. Now, I was going to do a further video on painting and weathering and other tricks to add on to these ruins, but I think I'm going to carry out those techniques on a different piece that I'm going to add to this set. So keep an eye for my barricades and pipes video. I will revisit this set of ruins with a few little features to embellish these pieces and unify them across the set with the new pieces that I build. But for now, I'm going to call it a day with these. These things are still relatively cheap. I've added the cost of a few vinyl tiles, a little bit more paint, and a $10 can of spray paint in addition to the cost I incurred last time. But if you're doing it like I do here and you're spreading it out over time, I still only spent another 20 bucks to kick these up to the next level of depth and detail. I do have a few more tricks to show you before I go though. This piece of ruin is something that I built forever ago, and as you might notice, I built this originally in one piece and then I cut it into two pieces. And that way it can be played either as one large building, or I can pull it apart and I can use it as the corners to two separate pieces of ruins. I can play it in a few different ways. It's a little bit modular. Now, as you look at this, you'll see a few more of the embellishments that I skipped out on these ruins that I've shown you in the video so far. Here you see all of these weathering streaks and like watermarks and that sort of thing. And in that case, I only used plain brown washes and black washes, and I brushed them on, kind of trying to focus on areas where there was broken corners of ruin, places where like water would either drip down or build up. In addition to that, these ruins have a couple of greebles on them. This clock face here, the face itself was from a set of buttons that I got at the craft store. It also came with gears, these gears inside here that I utilized to kind of give that kind of mechanical vibe. And here I was going a little bit more for like a Mechanicus icon rather than trying to imply an actual piece of machinery. The items around the clock face here are just foam core that I cut into pieces specifically to add more dimensionality around the clock face, and I did that before I did the stone texture paint, as you can see here. This little piece in the corner here, I was envisioning as sort of like basically the power box, you know, the utility connection, and that was some piece of some model that I pulled out of my bits box and a couple of cocktail stirrers that I put together, I painted, and then I glued onto the side just to give an extra little detail. And they're just all a bunch of little things that you can do to add more detail to your pieces. In this case, I don't use this ruin as much as I used to anymore, because while I like the embellishments, I think the large, plain, flat faces of it take up too much real estate compared to the embellishments. And it's a matter of proportions and getting those proportions right of your main piece compared to your details. That's all I've got for you today. If you missed the last video, I kit bashed a Baneblade. You can check it out right here. If you want to see what I'm doing in between videos, you can follow me on Instagram right here. The handle there is the same as the handle here. I'm not 100% sure what the next video is going to entail, but I will try to have it out relatively soon, and hopefully I'll be seeing you around.